didn't set out to chase a lost civilization or prove some hidden conspiracy. I was just looking at old Western maps, the kind archived quietly in major libraries, when I kept seeing the same word appear again and again. Across centuries of maps from respected cartographers covering huge stretches of Eurasia, that word was Tartary, something we're told never really existed, yet it's right there, in ink. And then, as geography became more precise and textbooks more confident, the name didn't get disproven. It simply fell silent, leaving a gap that's hard to ignore, even today. Before asking why Tartary disappeared, we have to slow down and ask a more basic question. What was it, actually? Because when you go back to Western maps from the 16th, 17th, even 18th centuries, Tartary isn't rare or marginal, it's everywhere, spanning enormous stretches of Eurasia, labeled calmly, confidently, by respected European cartographers. We're told modern geography is precise, fixed, scientific, but early maps weren't trying to do that. They weren't nation-states frozen in time. They were working documents built from fragments, merchant reports, missionary letters, second-hand accounts, incomplete surveys. When cartographers encountered regions that were vast, complex, and poorly understood, they didn't invent detail. They used categories. That's what Tartary was. Not a unified empire, not a single culture, not a country with borders and a capital. It was a broad label applied to lands largely outside direct European administration. Central Asia, Siberia, parts of what we now divide into dozens of modern states. Different peoples, languages, political systems, all flattened under one convenient name. Not a country, a category. If you look at preserved maps in the Library of Congress, you can see this process unfolding over time. Early maps mark Tartary as an immense zone, often subdivided later into Great Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary. As more information arrives, the label fractures. Smaller names appear, borders sharpen, coastlines improve, rivers straighten. The term doesn't vanish overnight. It retreats as specificity advances. Ask yourself why that matters. Because when we encounter Tartary today, out of context, it feels unsettling. A word we were never taught, a label that doesn't exist in modern textbooks. The instinct is to assume erasure, suppression, something hidden. But what the maps actually show is something quieter, a transition from approximation to classification, from naming the unknown to organizing the known. Tartary didn't fail a test of reality. It outlived its usefulness. And yet, when the name fades, the memory fades with it. We're left with the impression that something solid once stood there and was later denied, when in reality, what disappeared wasn't a place, but a way of describing the world before it was fully measured. That silence isn't evidence of deception, but it is evidence of how knowledge changes, and how easily, when terms fall away, they take entire mental maps with them. How do you draw a detailed map of a place you've never been to? Not flown over, not surveyed, not measured with instruments, just heard about. That's the problem early cartographers were solving, and it's where modern expectations quietly break down. We're used to maps as precise tools, coordinates, borders, standardized names. But for most of history, maps weren't records of certainty. They were negotiations with uncertainty. Think about what information actually existed in the pre-modern world. There were no satellites, no aerial surveys, no centralized databases. Knowledge moved slowly, carried by merchants along trade routes, by missionaries writing letters home, by diplomats repeating what they'd been told. Each account partial, each perspective biased, each detail unreliable. So cartographers did something pragmatic. They avoided false precision. Instead of filling vast interiors with invented detail, they used broad terms, flexible labels, placeholders that said, in effect, something is here, but we don't fully know what yet. Tartary was one of those solutions. a wide umbrella that reduced the risk of being wrong. Ask yourself, what's more dangerous on a map from the 17th century? Admitting uncertainty or pretending to know more than you do? Early mapmakers understood this instinctively. They focused on coastlines, ports, trade routes, the things they could verify. Interiors remained vague. Names were expansive. Boundaries were soft. Accuracy wasn't about detail, it was about usability. That's why Tartary appears so large and so persistent. It wasn't meant to describe a single political reality. It was meant to cover a gap in knowledge. A way to include regions that were real, inhabited, active, but not yet legible through European systems of classification. As information increased, the maps changed. Surveys replaced stories. Borders hardened. New names emerged, smaller and more specific. The old umbrella terms became liabilities. They obscured more than they clarified. And so they were retired. Not erased, replaced. The mistake we make now is reading those early maps backward. We treat them like failed versions of modern ones, instead of tools built for entirely different constraints. When we see a broad term like Tartary, we assume imprecision means ignorance, or worse, deception. But it was the opposite. It was restraint, not precision, coverage. The unsettling part isn't that early maps used vague language. It's that we've forgotten why. We've internalized the idea that the past should look like the present, just less advanced. When it doesn't, the gap feels suspicious. But once you understand the logic behind those maps, the limits of travel, the slow flow of information, the danger of overclaiming, something clicks. The presence of Tartary stops feeling mysterious, and its disappearance stops feeling deliberate. What changes is not the evidence. It's the framework we're using to read it. And that shift matters more than any single name on a map. When people notice Tartary disappearing from maps, the reflex is to assume removal. Someone decided it shouldn't be there anymore. But that framing misses what actually changed. The shift wasn't ideological. It was structural. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, exploration accelerated. Expeditions crossed interiors that had once been guessed at. Surveyors measured distances. Astronomers fixed longitude. Railways, telegraph lines, and trade routes demanded accuracy that earlier maps never needed. Vague zones stopped being useful. Not erased, but outgrown. As information increased, the logic of mapping changed with it. Broad labels that once reduced error now introduced it. Tartary, which had functioned as a safe approximation, became a problem precisely because it was too general. Precision required replacement, not defense. At the same time, political reality hardened. Empires formalized borders. Nation-states emerged. Administration required names that could be enforced, taxed, defended. Education followed power. Geography stopped describing uncertainty and started teaching authority. Not a mystery, but a transition. You can see this shift clearly in atlases from the 19th century. Regions, once grouped together, split into smaller units. New ethnonyms appear. New borders stabilize. What had been a conceptual umbrella dissolves into parts that feel more familiar to us today. Then comes the final layer, standardization. Once schooling became centralized, textbooks needed consistency. Students couldn't be taught provisional terms that depended on historical context. They needed fixed names, repeatable answers, clean maps. Tartary didn't disappear because it was forbidden. It disappeared because it no longer fit the system. Not deleted, but deprecated. This is where modern discomfort creeps in. When we encounter the term now, it feels like forbidden knowledge, something absent where we expect continuity. But that reaction says more about how we're taught history than about history itself. We're trained to think that if a name once existed and doesn't now, something must have gone wrong. But knowledge doesn't just accumulate, it reorganizes. Categories collapse, frameworks are replaced. Entire ways of describing the world get retired. Ask yourself what happens to yesterday's software when a new operating system takes over. The old programs aren't erased from existence, they're incompatible. That's what happened here. Tartary wasn't removed from textbooks as an act of concealment. It became unnecessary once the world it described was broken into finer resolution. Not hidden, superseded. And this pattern repeats far beyond Tartary. Names appear, serve a purpose, then quietly fall away as systems evolve. When we confuse that evolution with intent, we manufacture suspicion. When we understand it, we see continuity instead. The past doesn't vanish, it gets reorganized. And that realization reframes the question entirely, from who removed this name to why we expect history to remain static when everything else we rely on never does. That expectation, built into modern thinking, is the real illusion we rarely stop to examine. It shapes how we read maps, terms, and silence itself. Today. So why does this feel like it was hidden? Why does a missing word on a map trigger that specific kind of suspicion, like someone reached back through time and edited reality? Because your brain doesn't experience missing information as neutral. It experiences it as a signal. Think about it. If you open a book and pages are torn out, you don't assume it happened naturally. You assume intention. If a conversation suddenly goes quiet the moment you ask a certain question, you don't assume coincidence. You assume avoidance. Silence feels intentional, even when it isn't. That's the trap. And Tartary sits right in the middle of it. Textbooks train us to expect a clean timeline. One name replaces another, and we're given the final label as if it always existed. The messy transitional language, the provisional terms, the broad categories, the "we're not sure yet" labels, gets cut for clarity. Not because it's dangerous, but because it complicates the lesson. Not erased, but simplified. So when you later stumble onto an old map and see Tartary stamped across a continent, it doesn't feel like an outdated label. It feels like a secret you were never told. A missing chapter in your education. And that gap doesn't register as, "Oh, terminology changed." It registers as, "Why didn't anyone mention this?" Now add the internet. Online, you rarely encounter Tartary in context. You see it as a screenshot, a cropped image, a single dramatic frame without the surrounding centuries of cartographic practice. One word highlighted in red. One caption. They lied to you. And suddenly your brain does what it always does with fragments. It builds a story. Not a timeline, but a narrative. Because narratives are emotionally satisfying. They have villains. They have motives. They have clean endings. Real history doesn't. Real history is slow, technical, boring, full of overlapping terms that mean different things to different people at different times. Real history says, it depends. The internet says, it was taken from you. And your brain prefers certainty, even if the certainty is dark. Ask yourself what feels more unsettling. A world where knowledge evolves, or a world where someone is controlling it? The second one is scarier, yes, but it's also simpler. It explains the discomfort you feel when you meet a term you weren't taught. It gives you a reason for the silence. But there's one more layer most people miss. The name disappearing doesn't just remove a label. It removes a mental map. It erases the way older generations organized unknown space. When the category dies, your ability to imagine that category dies with it. And that absence, the inability to picture what people meant, creates a pressure in the mind. And pressure demands release. So the brain fills it with the most available explanation: concealment. Not because concealment is proven, but because it's psychologically convenient. The moment you understand that, you start seeing the pattern everywhere. Old terms, old classifications, old frames of reference. They vanish, and we mistake that vanishing for a cover-up, when sometimes it's just modernization. education trimming complexity, memory losing resolution. But the feeling remains. The gap remains. And that gap is powerful. Because once you notice an absence, you can't stop looking for what else might be missing. And this is where the investigation lands, not on a hidden empire, but on something more subtle. The way we name the world shapes what we're even able to remember about it. A map isn't just a picture of land. It's a decision, a frame, a vocabulary. And when that vocabulary changes, entire eras become harder to see. Tartary didn't vanish because someone scrubbed it from existence. It faded because the old labels stopped working. Exploration tightened the grid. Borders hardened. Schoolbooks demanded clean answers. The category that once covered the unknown was replaced by dozens of smaller, sharper names. Not a cover-up, but a rewrite of the filing system. And once you understand that, you start noticing other ghosts. Old terms that used to be normal, now absent. Regions renamed. Peoples reclassified. Lines moved. Whole concepts that feel obvious today simply didn't exist in the same form a few centuries ago. Ask yourself, how many things do you believe are timeless when they're really just standardized? Because the real story here isn't Tartary, it's the mechanism. The quiet process where knowledge becomes curriculum, where complexity gets trimmed, where language gets optimized, and where the past becomes simpler than it ever was. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. Archives are deeper than you think. So if you want to keep digging, don't chase a single missing word. Chase the pattern. Follow the terms that disappeared, the categories that collapsed, the labels that got replaced, and watch how the map in your mind redraws itself.